Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. We're kicking out and welcome to today's webinar for SMAPE on tendering shared mobility services organized by the SMAPE project. My name is Jorge Manso Garcia. I am part of POLIS, which is the leading network on cities and regions working on transport innovation. And I will be the moderator for your wonderful session today. So as most of us know here, I will say shared mobility plays a crucial role in the transition towards zero carbon urban mobility. And the goal of SMAPE, this Interreg Europe project, is to cooperate and exchange practices and experiences from all over Europe. From the north part of Europe, the northest part of Europe in Bergen, to one of the most southern parts with the North Asian region. So shared mobility, whether bike sharing, e-scooter, or car sharing, has emerged as a crucial tool to complement public transport, reduce car dependency, and improve accessibility. However, the success of these services do not rely on technology alone, but they depend on how cities and regions structure and manage their procurement and regulatory processes. That's why tendering plays today a huge role, and well-designed tenders enable local governments to ensure service quality by setting clear and operational safety standards, promote equity and accessibility by requiring services to operate in all districts and not just those profitable ones, encourage innovation by allowing flexibility in these service models and integration with public service, and drive sustainability by embedding criteria and low carbon vehicles and circular economy. And lastly, ensure the long-term viability of these services, meaning that they foster fair competition, they avoid monopolies, and they secure financial sustainability for both the cities and operators. So when done right, tenders allows to steer shared mobility ecosystem toward public goals. In this webinar, or in today's menu, we will have Fanny Boccioli from POLIS, a colleague of ours, presenting the recent findings from our research on tendering shared micromobility in European cities. We will pass to the main speakers, which will be Rebecca Karbaumer from the city of Bremen, which is the lead partner of the project, SMAPE, and she will share the city's experience in both car sharing and the new bike sharing system that they have, Bre.Bike, that will be launching in 1st of April, no joke. And lastly, we will have the experience and the perspective of the private sector, and we will have Marion, Galan, Alfonso, and Aleksander Lannoy from Donkey Republic, which will present what are the main challenges from operators when it comes to developing a tender or applying for a tender, and how to focus on creating synergies between operators and public entities. And with this, we will have also a Q&A question for all of the presentations that I will invite you to do on the Q&A box, and they will respond to after each presentation. With that said, I give the floor to Fanny.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me today. So the aim today is to give you some insights from our latest report, which is Careful What You Wish For, a bit spooky, practical implications of rules and requirements for shared micromobility. So in this report, as it says, we really looked at regulation of shared micromobility. So in most cities, this is an ongoing process. So rules weren't ready when these new services started to deploy floating e-bikes and e-scooters. So in order to catch up, rules for shared micromobility have tried to address a lot of things in the same time. So the access to the market, the operations, behavior, vehicle characteristics, and data sharing. So a common process, and this is where we come to today's topic, has been the use of public tenders launched by cities to select a limited number of operators. And in these tenders, rules that have first been stated as conditions or a criteria for selections later become binding conditions for the operation. So this report really looks into 6 rules that are recurrently discussed in tenders for shared micromobility. So these are speed limits, parking, helmets, user education, local employment, and life cycle assessment. So to explore the practical implications of these rules, we reached out and really listened to the professionals in the field. So it's really important also to point out that the purpose of this report is not to take a side on each issue, nor to provide like detailed recommendations or best practices. Instead, we really aim to collect, articulate the practical implications as they are experienced and shared by field experts. So we hope this will help all the stakeholders concerned to learn from practical experience, both for those who have to apply them in the field and also for those who have to conceive them. So I will come next to the purpose and methodology. So yes, perfect. As Jorge mentioned, so POLIS is a network of local and regional authorities, and this report has been developed first and foremost to support the work of our members. And the purpose is really to provide a strategic perspective on the practical implications of some of the rules which are often mentioned for shared micromobility. So for the purpose of this report, like shared micromobility includes bike and e-bikes, e-scooters, and e-mopeds. And for the report, we had a literature review, focus group interviews, then we had additional interviews with experts, and we discussed also the first results, and then had a review of the draft version of the report. The focus group participants were either professionals working for a shared micromobility operator or professionals working for a local authority. So how will I proceed? I will go through these 6 topics and explain a little bit on each of them. And for each of them, you have one of the main quotes from the focus group interview. So coming to speed limits, operators and local authorities shared with us that, for example, when you mix e-scooters and bikes with motorized traffic, imposing low speed limits on micromobility will actually increase the speed differential, and this will increase the risk that is perceived by users. So they will push them actually to drive on the sidewalk. Another thing is that some local authorities like to use geofencing, and before that, operators have to carry out field tests, bringing e-scooters into designated zones to check their performance and also to determine like buffer zones. And this takes a lot of time and resources. Some cities that use geofencing also try to create like a lot of small low speed zones. And when you have these different complicated designs together with a lack of GPS accuracy, that can cause, for example, an e-scooter to slow down unexpectedly in the middle of traffic, also increasing in increased risk for users. When it comes to parking, participants shared that something that is very important, I mean, it's very logical also to us, is that the placement of shared micromobility parking on sidewalks really sends the wrong message. So this encourages also the user to ride on sidewalks, for example. Something that has also been mentioned is that car parking is often a source of revenue for local authorities. So the fear of the loss of this revenue has often also been an obstacle when it comes to the conversion of car parking spaces to other kinds of parking. And this also poses then the question, okay, who should then pay for the creation of these parking spots? And another thing that also came out in the discussions is that satisfying all stakeholders is very challenging, especially if they have demands that are a bit contradictory. So on the one hand, you don't want shared vehicles on the sidewalks, but then you also don't want to convert car parkings. And so in areas with high car parking demand, like local electives fear a lot of backlashes. So the next issue we discussed was helmets. And the first thing that has been said to us is that ensuring that helmets are available, so not stolen, clean and well maintained, adds a lot of operational complexity. And talking about clean is also like this issue of hygiene. Like for something you're wearing on your head, like what is clean enough? And what does this imply also in terms of operation and costs to have to add this? And also something that has been mentioned was that helmets can, of course, protect against falls, but they offer limited protection against the collision with motorized vehicles that could be at 50 kilometers per hour or more. The next point we discussed is user education. So first, quickly, what do we mean by that? So it's the idea of wanting users to behave properly. So many cities ask operators to invest in user education, so to encourage safe and civil behavior. But you know, changing user behavior is a very complex and long-term process. And certain user education initiatives, like for example, this onboarding with the app, is sometimes a bit complicated because sometimes users like to bypass them. And so in the long run, this might not be the right solution. And also it's important to go beyond the users, but also to the non-users that are often like unaware of shared micromobility operations. And sometimes this lack of understanding can lead them of perceptions of like an uncontrolled operation and concerns about safety in the city. And another thing that has been mentioned here is from the operator side mostly is also like, is this their responsibility to educate the public about shared mobility rules and safety? Or should this be a part of something broader, for example, in school level? And then we have the last, no, not yet the last point, we have local employment. So some cities are trying to promote like socially responsible employment practices to encourage also operators to hire local workers. And something that has been mentioned is that a lot of operators think that there's a significant financial risk associated with that, particularly also given the fluctuating nature of demand throughout the year. And cities have noticed that and have also tried to adapt with providing longer licenses in order to provide also a bit of more of a long-term stability for the operators and for the employees. And also something that has been mentioned is that there's also the issue with the regulatory scope. So local governments cannot tell a company basically how to run their business, but what they can do, for example, is to support companies that have an equality plan or a gender plan or that demonstrate like social responsibility. Now we come to the last point, actually, which was the life cycle assessment. And cities are more and more also interested in understanding the environmental impacts. And the life cycle assessment analyzes this impact from the production, use, and the end of the life of a vehicle. And something that has been mentioned is that currently lower emission figures are often, of course, seen as like the best. But if you don't have a standardized calculation rules, then some aspect of the assessment can be omitted, and this leads to a distorted picture. Also, something that has been mentioned is that vehicles also should be lasting longer, and that should create a larger focus on refurbishment. And also, this was the last point that is also very important. There's also a need for more training of the regulators because few people can effectively actually read and understand and verify the information in the LCA. So this leads us to the conclusions. And what kind of conclusions were we able to draw from what we heard from the operators and the local authorities? So rules really do have practical implications. So the effectiveness of a rule requires compliance and enforcement. And these also require the execution of several activities from the operators who have to comply and the local authorities who have to verify and impose corrections and penalties. Also, something we noticed that obvious doesn't mean right. So often there's no simple match between a problem and a rule to fix it. So what is at stake with a rule is not only the principle it sets, but the condition that exists or not to comply with it or to enforce it. Then we have something we call beware of rules by public request, because regulations have often been developed in a reactive way in response to problems with the complaints often from non-users. But now this is starting to change, and now we see user complaining about a lack of infrastructure for these services, and these are also becoming more and more prominent. Something that I think we know is that regulation is not easy. Like, a lot of cities are aware of the needs and the expectations of the operators, and they often have similar concerns. But beyond that, they have to work with a regulatory framework and with different entities that may have different interests. Then we have rules need enforcement, and enforcement needs capacity. So some cities just don't have the capacity to monitor and check that the operators and users are complying with all the regulations. And also, that was more of a question we had at the end. Can shared fleets actually educate individual vehicles? Because for most rules for shared micromobilities do not apply to private micromobility vehicles. And now that they're becoming more and more popular and they're being sold more and more and beginning like growing, we ask the question if mobility services can play a role in educating end users and establishing norms that influence also the private use of micromobility vehicles. So I'm sorry, I was a bit rushing because it's not easy to bring all of this different points of view and opinions in 10 minutes, but I hope that it was interesting for all of you. And the report will be coming out soon. So in the next couple of months, in the next month, let's say. So I hope you also get to read it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fanny. So I see we're a bit lagging behind with the time, but I think they can reach out to you through these emails that they're on the screen right now. And please do if you have some questions. And I think this sets perfectly the table for Rebecca to give their points of view on the many points that Fanny has raised.
There we go. Now I'm unmuted. Hi, everybody. Greetings from Bremen in Germany. So I'll take what Fanny presented basically in a more abstract sort of meta level down to the local practical level, and can say that some of our experiences were really quite similar here in Bremen, and presenting on how we tender for shared mobility in a speedy 15 to 20 minutes. Hopefully you can see my screen now. Super. So if you don't know the city of Bremen, we're located in northern Germany near the North Sea and have 575,000 inhabitants. So it's not a small city, but it feels like we often call Bremen a village with a tram. 6 shared mobility providers, 29,000 car share users, and as Jorge already mentioned, we're the lead partner of the SMAPE project. And just like the other SMAPE partners, for us, shared mobility is part of the sustainable and inclusive mobility pyramid. And there are many, many different types of shared mobility, as you all know and as you can guess. And you can already guess that there are just as many tendering requirements for shared mobility for a city as there are shared modes. And those tendering requirements are first and foremost governed by EU tendering rules, and then where there are national rules in place, like the German national car share law, that also dictates requirements for the state and local tendering. There are other forms of shared mobility where there are no national rules on tendering for shared mobility, because what we're as a city providing is space and, for instance, not paying for a service. So like tendering for e-scooter services is not governed by a national law, because we are only saying here's a space available, who wants to operate on it. But what I'm going to share with you today is a focus on how we tender for car share services and our recent experience with tendering for bike sharing. And I will leave out the e-scooters because it gets way too complicated and we can talk days and days about this. So let's dive into the car sharing tender. So in Bremen, we have mainly station-based car sharing at 150 stations, and a third of those are in the public realm. 650 cars, and some of them are free-floating in the public realm. But we, as a city, do not tender for stations and for providers on private property. Our tendering applies only to the stations in the public realm. So as we expand the network of what we call Mobilpunkte, or mobility hubs that feature car sharing in the public realm. There we go. And when do we do this in the planning process? Planning a Mobilpunkt, a car share station in the public realm, takes roughly 1 to 2 years. It's a small measure, but it takes a long time. And we do the tendering process for car sharing, or the expression of interest, about halfway through that planning stage. So we do the original stakeholder engagement, we select a site and draft technical plans. And then we go into this tendering process, which for us is a expression of interest procedure. And that's determined by national law, but also by the German, or by the Bremen's state car sharing law, that we have to do a transparent procedure for handing out available car share spaces. So when we get to this point in the planning process, when we have a draft for a mobility hub, that's when we go into the tendering process. And now it's where it gets really exciting for those of you, or it can be really dry and boring, either way, is the tendering process, or you can repeat after me if you like in your own auspices, Interessensbekundungsverfahren. It's one of those great German words. And what does that look like? For us in Bremen, we do basically a public notice or a call for expression of interest from car share providers by saying, all right, we're halfway through this planning process. We are offering 10 stations with 3 car sharing parking bays each. And we mention what they feature, like is there charging infrastructure? What other services are there nearby? Are there going to be other services integrated? And so on and so forth. There we go. And then we pass on to basically the basic. In order to apply for this expression of interest, providers must meet basic quality criteria to even operate a car sharing. So they have to meet this criteria, which first and foremost are meeting environmental criteria for car sharing. They have to be either certified or meet the criteria of the Blue Angel for car sharing services. And they have to provide proof that they reduce car ownership through regular customer surveys. And one car sharing vehicle has to replace at least 6 privately owned cars in order for a provider to be able to operate a station in the public realm. Next part of the process is if we have several providers or multiple providers that are expressing interest to operate the same station, we give them an opportunity to come to an agreement between themselves. And also to make final decisions on the station equipment that they need. Do they need a foundation for charging infrastructure or for special signage? And that's the phase where we agree upon this. If there is competition, for instance, if providers can't agree which provider gets which space or which provider gets how many spaces at a location, then we apply really formalized selection criteria. We as a city intervene then as a moderator, and we it basically turns into a classic tendering process where we hand out points for certain quality criteria. And then we make the decision which provider gets those spaces. But first we leave it up to the market to kind of agree and regulate themselves. Once they're through this process, then they are allowed to apply for a special use permit or a service contract for the Mobilpunkt. And that defines the amount of time and that they must operate the site. They cannot apply for a tender and then not put cars at the station that they've applied for. And also the fee is determined. There might be, if some of you might have a question, like what is this formalized selection criteria? If there is competition, what do we look at? We look at specifically 5 different criteria, like a car share provider with a higher car replacement ratio gets more points. A car share provider with a broader range of vehicles in the fleet also gets more points, because that's what makes a car sharing service really attractive, is a variety of vehicles, where you need them, when you need them. So from a small compact car to a large van. Family friendliness plays a role, and barrier-free vehicles. Is there automatic transition? Do they have handicap friendly vehicles in their fleet? Those would get extra points as well. But a little side note, we have never had to carry out this part of the procedure in Bremen before, because there hasn't been any competition, and the one time there was competition, the providers came to a really fast agreement among themselves. So it's been an ideal situation so far. So we get through this point, we've carried out the expression of interest, then we do the rest of the planning process, essentially. Then we build the stations, and then it goes into operation. We wouldn't build a station if we didn't have a provider to operate the station, and that does happen sometimes, especially when we're looking for a provider for more peripheral neighborhoods or new development sites that are still a little bit financially risky for new providers. So because we don't subsidize as a city, we don't pay for the provider to operate, it's essentially we have to live with the fact that there might be some sites or locations that a provider is not interested in operating. And after all that, ta-da, this is what happens. This is what it turns into. It's a mobility hub with marked car sharing parking bays and sort of ideal solution. And once we've done the tender, a car share provider is committed to operating the station for 8 years. And then the whole thing starts again. We have to do the tender again. Those 8 years is determined by the national car share law. So that was car sharing, tendering for car sharing in a nutshell. Here comes tendering for bike sharing in a nutshell. This is a procedure that we've just been through in the city of Bremen, because last year we just tendered for a 5-year concession for bike sharing here in Bremen. And I would say it was a challenge and it was an ordeal, because it was the first time that we as a city have done this. And for us as a city, we don't have a centralized tendering department, so it means, and this is often the case for cities, it means that people, the experts on shared mobility, all of a sudden have to become experts on tendering and technicalities of a system. So we spent a lot of time, a lot of months racking our brains about how many vehicles we want and what types of bike share vehicles we want, what kind of system. And we decided we want 70% of the bikes in free floating and 30% in station based. We had to figure out service area quality criteria for bicycles. So we had to come up with the technical plans and requirements. Requirements for the customer service and like the system app, how do you deal with wrong parking, things that Fanny mentioned, like managing the space and the speed and the tariffs, things like that. So that was a challenge, and we definitely couldn't have done it without the help of other German cities who had recently been through a tendering process, who really helped us out. So if any of you here are doing tendering for the first time, I can really recommend asking your city colleagues in other places for advice so you don't have to start from scratch completely. So after drafting the tendering documents, we published the EU-wide tender in April last year, and it had to be an EU-wide tender because this is a concession, so we are subsidizing the system, and we had a budget of 2 million euros for 5 years. So this was above this EU funding threshold or tendering threshold, so that's why we had to tender EU-wide and not just nationally. And because we're not tendering experts, we hired a lawyer who's an expert in tendering from the very beginning to kind of help us through the process, and also to help us when responding to questions from bidders, and to make sure that we documented everything correctly from beginning to end, and carried out the formal procedure correctly. The fun part, this is especially the fun part, the tendering process had 2 stages. One, basically, of course, is making sure that the written offers that we got complied with the basic and the quality criteria of the tender that we laid out. What was really fun, though, was then the second stage was the testing of the vehicles. Or of course, bikes can look really great on paper, but they might not be so great to use. So all of the providers that applied for the tender also had to provide a test cargo bike and a test standard bike for neutral test drivers for us to test the bikes in the city and evaluate their quality and riding comfort and all of those things on a standardized route. Always has to be standardized. But that was a fun day. We had good weather, and then basically the easiest part was compiling all this, summing up points and justifying your decision to issuing our contract. And now this is where Fabian, my colleague, who's also here today, is spending most of his time now, or has for the last really 5 very intense months, is preparing for the system launch. The tender was won by Bre.Bike. The system will be called Bre.Bike, and we'll be launching, as Jorge said, on the 1st of April, so it's no joke. But we will have roughly 1,400 standard bikes in the city, 60 cargo bikes at Mobilpunkte and stations across the city. And in order to provide an incentive for users, it will be free to use for the first month. So that, especially students, a semester will start, they can try out the system citywide. And the provider, as well as the city, we're carrying out complementary communication campaigns for the launch as well. And then this is what it will look like. Basically, this is it will be a citywide service. This is a rough map of the city of Bremen with the areas for the free-floating bike sharing, areas for the station-based bike sharing. All of the dots will be the stations, also located at mobility hubs. And we'll have the 2 types of bikes, and we'll also be integrating bike sharing parking into our existing Mobilpunkt, so existing car share network. So we're really looking forward to that. It's definitely been a challenge or a push up until now. But it's really nice to, when you go through this tendering procedure, which can be a really dry process, to then come to the end and to really see services on the street, so that people can use vehicles rather than having to own them. So they don't have to own a cow. You don't have to own a cow to drink a glass of milk. You don't need to own a car or a bike in order to enjoy the ride. Thanks so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for the perfect, I will say, roadmap of both your car sharing and bike sharing tendering services. It's great to hear in such a clear and easy way how you're doing step by step, and it's something that I usually ask for, or I wonder how it goes. I will pass to the questions, and we have a question by Triso. I don't know if you can see it there, otherwise I can read it out loud for everyone. Is did you ask for cargo bikes? What about electric, non-electric bikes? And did you get some insights in operators' own cargo bike sharing? Will be interesting since the market is rather small and stable, and we can see with the parts of cargo.
Yeah, that's a good point. It was we decided to combine the tenders. Originally, we thought was maybe to do 2 separate tenders, but from a user perspective and lowering barriers to use bike share, we decided in the end that it was important to combine the system and have cargo bikes and standard bikes from one provider instead of having to have 2 apps, because we don't have a mobility app in Bremen. So we decided to combine it. It also allowed us to stretch the budget a little bit more. And yes, we asked for cargo bikes. We asked for 40. And the provider that won ended up offering 60, which is great, which means we can have more cargo bikes at more mobility hubs across the city. We did think about electric cargo bikes versus, what was it, bio bikes, sometimes, or muscle powered bikes. And essentially we could get more for our money if we went for muscle powered bikes rather than electric bikes. Bremen is quite flat. The highest increase in elevation we have is 3 meters going up the dam at the river. So we decided for a number of reasons that we weren't going to go for electric for the cargo bikes either. Also, it increases. We'd had some chats with providers. Also, we're in a network for cargo bike, the Tink network, and also in the city network, exchanging on experiences, and found that the feedback we got was that the installation, cost for stations for charging cargo bikes was more expensive. We'd have to hire, digging club. They were more like prone to vandalism and theft, and winter and freezing temperatures would also be a problem. So we'd stay with the muscle-powered bikes to keep the cost low, and we can also get and pay for a longer service rather than electrification. So yeah, it's a small market, and that was a challenging point. We did discuss quite a lot if we did do separate or a tender together, and then in the end we had to think about the user friendliness and longevity and value for money. Yeah, long question to answer answer to your question, Frieza.
I will merge two questions to be a bit quicker to give space to Marion and Aleksander. And these are from Matthew and Sammy, and it's how long did the bike share tender procedure take from the start to the bike launch? And also, how is the process to end up on a 2 million budget for 5-year concessions and defining the service size and quality?
It took a year. Basically, we published a tender in April 2024, and we'll launch the system this year in April, plus the preparation time before acquiring the budget, figuring out where we want to go as a city, getting the budget approval. That was a 46-month process before we were able to publish the tender. So we were really on a tight timescale and a really high political priority. And how did we arrive at a 2 million budget for a 5-year concession? We basically estimated the average cost of a standard bike. We were going for 1,000 bikes plus cargo bikes. We did sort of a market assessment and from some providers. Heard it's what it roughly costs to the price for standard bike and for cargo bike, and estimated the operating costs per bike per day, compared it to potential revenue, and decided, okay, we cannot finance 100% system. We can't pay for the whole thing. We can finance 50% of the operating costs. So we went in with a budget for paying for the purchase of the bike and the buildings of all of the stations, and a 50% operating cost subsidy for 5 years, and arrived at around 2 million euros. I'm sure that some providers would disagree that you can't cover the costs, or that it's much cheaper. But at some point, we had to make an estimate based on the experience of providers that we had in exchange with.
Okay, I'll ask you to respond quickly to the next two questions to give a space for the next, and I'll turn to car sharing to have a bit of a variety. And this question is from Erden. And is, do you think offering subsidies to car share providers could increase the number of available cars, especially in areas when you don't need them, and drive down rental costs?
Yes.
If so, why will you not subsidize them?
Thought I'd be able to answer that question. Yes, is the answer. And if so, yeah, we're working on a subsidy concept, but there are a lot of things that have to, state aid. There are EU regulations that limit state aid to private companies, and we have to make sure that that it's not legally. I can't think of the English word for it right now. Compromising, or it's a complicated legal world, but yes, at least for temporary subsidies do make sense in more financially difficult areas. I would say the goal should always be that car sharing services should be able to operate without a subsidy in the long run, but especially if you want to expand into peripheral areas, a temporary subsidy, in our concept, it's for 5 years. reducing the subsidy is just to help kick off the service from the start. But providers should be interested in cities should be interested in services being able to cover their own operating costs over time.
Okay, thank you. I go quickly, please, through the last question, and it's whether you have interested municipalities around Bremen in joining the bike sharing system, or do you have foresee that at any certain point?
Yes, we do, but our available budget is limited to the city boundaries of Bremen. So there's this challenge. Yes, it would make sense to have a regional bike share system like in Antwerp or around Kiel, for example, but our budget is really so limited. And I think our colleagues here from Donkey Republic can agree that 2 million is really stretching it for 5 years, and that's why we've said we can't go across city boundaries at this time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, and I think you're giving the floor perfectly to Marion and Aleksander. Aleksander and Marion, I will give you the floor right now.
Yes, hi everyone, and thank you for having us, Jorge. I'm Aleksander Lannoy. I'm the market lead at Donkey Republic for Belgium, and as Jorge said, I will be joined by Marion today, who will also quickly introduce herself before we start going.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining. I'm Marion Galan Alfonso, and I'm the head of public affairs for Donkey Republic.
So, as already been said, we will share some insights from an operator's perspective today on public tenders for bike sharing systems. We will discuss 3 points, which are the challenges operators face in tenders, what makes a tender attractive for operators like us, and then in the end, we will discuss how cities and operators can better align their goals to create a bike share system that's successful in the long run. At the end of the session, we'll also have a short Q&A, so questions can be dropped in the chat as happened before. And then a quick introduction to Donkey Republic for those who might not be familiar with us yet. We are a Danish bike share company. We were founded in 2014 in Copenhagen, which means we currently have over a decade of experience in the micromobility industry. Today, we operate over 23,000 bikes, which is a mix of e-bikes and pedal bikes across multiple European cities. Some of our largest operations include Copenhagen, Geneva, Hanover, Amsterdam. And in Belgium, we operate, as already said, regional as well, where we have the region of Antwerp, Waasland, and Mechelen, all connected into one network. In every city and region we work in, we've learned a lot about what makes a bike share system successful, but also, and equally as important, what can make it fail. That's why today we want to share some of these key learnings with you, and I'll give the floor to Marion to start off on our first point.
Yes, thank you, Aleksander. We're going to start with the challenges that we've been facing and also other operators. The first part would be during the tender writing process. We saw a lot of tender documents where the public authority is stating how to run the bike sharing system rather than stating much more the results they want out of the bike sharing system, because actually you're going to operate differently if you want, let's say, to move people away from cars in the city center, or if you want to provide a first last mile solution for the suburbs for people commuting to and from work with public transport, or if you just want to have more students on bikes. So that can be all of those goals, obviously, but there's usually an outcome in your mind. And it's really good to have it clearly specified and ask the different operators, either in the tender process, in the market consultation, or later on for the tender itself, how would you do it? So then you don't have fixed process that you have in mind because you've seen it somewhere else, but rather something that would fit exactly the needs of your city or your region. So basically, do not write your tender on copying directly the current system you have or the system next door, but leave a door open for more innovative solutions and maybe more competitive bids. And the last point, and I think that was also mentioned a bit in the presentation before with Rebecca, we need to have sometimes a longer duration of contract, because 2 to 4 years, as we can see sometimes, it is very risky for most operators, especially when you want to have, let's say, affordable user pricing, things like that. That means that the operators and the providers, they need time to make sure that their first initial investment, or the CapEx, the bikes, the stations, the warehouses, the workshops, and so on, are not too expensive, and they are not risking too much for 2 years or 4 years operation. The second point, and I think it's always the main one, is the budget and the price. When you have, let's say, when you can't get the budget you wanted to, because I know all of you want to have a really good budget, but you can't always have it, then yes, you can have a low budget. But the risk is usually with the low budget, it leads to a fixation on pricing in the tender itself. That doesn't mean, of course, you should not evaluate on price. Of course, you should. But if you evaluate mainly on price, let's say 80% on price, as we've seen in some tenders, sometimes even 90%, then that means you're starting what we call a price war between operators. So basically, you will have low quality bids because the only thing that we see you're expecting is cheap. And that means it gets very hard to also maintain high level of maintenance, of having a good pricing for the user, or making sure you have stations also in areas where you have less public transport, where you would need maybe some social tarification, social pricing, and so on. So think about it when you're also looking into your budget. You can have not such a high budget, of course, but think also of making sure you add the quality side in your tender and the sustainability one. And the last point, and that's what also was mentioned, is the fact that there's often some challenges regarding either the lead time or the legal side. And sometimes you have very short lead time, especially for complex tenders. So we're talking, for example, regional tenders with multiple public entities, or different integration within public transports and so on. And that does not leave us enough time to prepare something that is tailor-made for you. So we need to have time to make sure we can also consult and work with associations on the ground, local associations, maybe public transport on the ground and so on, to make sure to have an offer that would make sense for the results you want, and not just a copy-paste of other offers that have been sent. And also, most of the time, when the tender is delayed internally, the fixed date at the end, the launch date, it's fixed, right? So that means we have a very short time to launch the operation. And that can be challenging, again, depending on your requirements. For some, it won't be, because it's requirements that are quite standard. But if you have more custom-made ones, then the lead time needs to be longer. And on the point of the legal side, we know it's complex, and tenders are sometimes not carried out accurately or not following all the rules we've seen before that can be local, state, or European rules and laws. So our recommendation, and that's what we bring to the last point, is to always have your legal department or consultants make sure that you're respecting everything, and have people help you to make sure you won't have an issue at the end of the tender of the award. And Zenda is going to present you now what is an attractive tender for operators, so you can get as many offers as possible.
Thank you, Marion. So now we're going to talk about what makes a tender strong and attractive, not just for operators like us, but also for a region, city, municipality, and most importantly, the end user. Some of the points that I will discuss have already been touched upon by Marion, so you can see that it's all linked to each other. So the first one, which actually starts before the actual tender, is engage in market dialogues. Talk with operators, because one of the biggest mistakes we see is a tender written without first consulting the operators. Every operator has a different approach. They work differently operationally, and they have different technological capabilities. So if you don't consult multiple providers beforehand, you might unknowingly create a tender that only fits one operator's model, and that then will limit possible competition. So it is important to organize these market consultations, because this way you gain insights from different providers, and you can also ensure that the tender remains open to multiple solutions, which then creates a stronger and more competitive process. As said by Marion as well, try to avoid price wars and focus on the quality as well. It's always tempting to go for the least expensive offer, but when price is the main selection criteria, it can lead to serious problem. The price wars can lead to operators underbidding to win the contract, and then struggling later on to actually maintain the service that they agreed upon in their contracts. And This can then lead to a system with broken bikes, bad user experience, low ridership, but it also damages the reputation of the local bike sharing, but also bike sharing in general. So it's important here to balance price and quality criteria and really take into consideration on how an operator plans to maintain and expand the system over time. The third point that's really important is make sure there's room for negotiation in the tender process, because every city is different and every operator also works differently. So some strict requirements, especially when they are linked to high financial penalties, can actually harm the operation rather than improve it. If there's no flexibility in this, then operators might be forced to increase prices to the end users or to reduce several the SLA set just to stay viable during the operation. So here it's important to build one or maybe several negotiation rounds before actually finalizing the contract, because in this way, the cities and the operators can align their expectations and find practical solutions that work in real life conditions, not just on paper. Linked to this one is then, of course, make the sets, SLAs, and penalties realistic and fair. Of course, SLAs are essential for setting standards, but excessive fines can make operations really expensive, which then can lead to higher pricing to end users, as said before. And it can also make the bike sharing itself less affordable, which is not the idea of bike sharing. And next to that as well, when penalties are too strict, some operators may choose just to not bid, leaving you with fewer options. So then for the next one is also something that was talked about more on the regional ones. And it was also a question that was asked before. Try to make your network expandable to neighboring cities and municipalities, because a well-designed bike share should not just be limited to city center, but the people from surrounding municipalities should also be able to travel across those borders without having to change systems. So you can structure the tender in a way that it's possible for surrounding municipalities, cities, and maybe regions to join later under an extended network contract. Because in this way, the system can grow organically, and you don't force the users to deal with different systems over different municipalities. Another important one is revenue sharing. So ensure that there's fair revenue sharing for operators, because if an operator only receives a small percentage of user revenue, they can have less incentive to reinvest in improving the service, because the fair share of revenue, which creates more revenue income for the operators, can lead to a higher expansion of the system, for example, by placing bike without subsidies, because the bikes make enough money, or they can invest in hiring more local employees to make the system run better, or to improve their local marketing. So here you should look at ensure that an operator at least receives 50% or ideally 100% of the revenue from the user fees. And then, yeah, the last point, but not the least important one, is also something that was touched upon a few times already, is look at long-term contracts, because they create sustainability, stability, and growth. Bike sharing requires a significant upfront investment. This can be the purchasing of bikes, to setting up the operations, to other hardware that needs to be installed. So if you then have a contract that only lasts 3 to 4 years, operators might struggle to actually recover their investments before the next tender cycle starts. And next to that, frequent changes in operators can also confuse users, which can then lead to lower ridership and adaptation. So it's really important that a longer contract is set, because it's for the users, it's better to get familiar with the system. For the cities, it's easier to build a long and strong partnership with the operator. And the operator itself has enough time to actually make the system financially sustainable, which means less reliance on the public subsidies. So here we then look at contracts that last at least 5 years or ideally longer. Then now I'll give the floor again to Marion for our third point, which we will discuss.
I'll go quite quickly because it touches upon what we've seen. So yes, market consultation, please do it, but also attend conferences such as obviously the POLIS conference or the National Police Conference, like Police Mobility in Germany, for example. Velocity, the different webinars like you're doing today, to learn about all the projects, because you can get inspiration, and as Rebecca mentioned before, contact other cities, other regions to understand what is working in the operation, and what you should avoid, because you can actually save a lot of time by doing this, which means that the second point is spending a lot of time on your writing and the process can be also limited if you got a lot of input from the outside, from operators, of course, but also from public entities. I wrote down like the fact that you should start 3 to 4 years before, the launch of the contract, so the launch of the system. If you can do it in a year and a half, that's great. And I think please reach out to Rebecca, because I think she has a lot of really good insights. But make sure you have time and you leave time in your planning, because you can have the person in charge going on sick leave or maternity, paternity leave. You can have a lot of things happening. And also your legal department needs to be consulted every step of the way to ensure that you don't have issues in the end. And that takes time as well. So basically, you can't plan for everything. So make sure you have room for the unplanned. And one very short note would be to support the operators in also getting multiple revenue streams. That can be to leave it open to have a sponsorship, or to have a B2B system where you can sell corporate memberships to big companies in your area to facilitate the first mile, last mile to go to work with public transport, or things like that, or also upsell in the surrounding regions under a certain type of contract if you want to have a bigger system in the end. And last but not least, as we started with it, we'll end with it. Please describe what you want in the end, and not how you want it done. And this will help you get it much more successful. So I don't know if we have time for a short Q&A, and I cannot see the chat box, Jorge, but
yeah, it's okay. I think we can have a bit for everyone, for those who wants to remain, even if we pass the hour a bit. It's okay. I think it's more interesting that having closing remarks. So I think we have a couple of questions. So the first one is from Jupka, and it's like, whether do you have any example of tendering documents that have been written in a way that suits better for operators? So I guess any example of any document or any public authority that has drafted in a way that it suits your way of understanding the market.
The first point would be to consult the Cycling Industries Europe website. You have a lot of input on that, where it's a lot of very different operators that have participated. So you can find some guidelines over there. And of course, us as a provider and operator, we do have a lot of documents that we can share that we got from different tenders all over Europe that we think was good. And also, for example, we have documents that share examples of contracts, also, of course, redacted, so you can't know specifications, but to understand how to set up a framework agreement, so you can then expand your system from a city-wide to region-wide system, on how municipalities can join in and agreeing on a basically financing that they have to put in to join the system, and so on. So we do have quite a few of those documents. If you want to reach out to us, that's very easy. It's our first names and at donkeyrepublic.com. So don't hesitate. And that would depend also on your system. So if you're a smaller size city, or if you're a regional entity wanting to have a regional network, obviously those would be very different documents.
Thank you, Marion. Then we have a question that I think you touch upon a bit, and it's what will be an ideal lead time for you as an operator from the publication to the submission in order to be well prepared?
So it will depend if you go in different rounds or not. So some cities or regions are going to tender with a pre-qualification, then a qualification, a negotiation round, and then a best and final offer. That takes a lot of time, but that is the best, because then you get really into the details. If you have, let's say, a more simple requirement or more simple system, you can probably tender in 1 to 2 phases. We still recommend always to have a negotiation round or an oral presentation where you can negotiate, depends how you want to call it. So we would say usually from the first documents being published, not the market consultation, but the first documents being published, to the award, that should be at least 6 months, most likely a bit more. Sometimes it takes up to a year if you want to have pre-qualification, qualification, negotiation, that can take even more than a year.
Perfect.
And then from the signature of the contract to the launch, the best is to have a 4-year. But obviously, I know that sometimes it's a bit difficult.
Great to hear. And also we have another question for SMAPE partner, and it's Lars, who asked, how do the competition from the subsidized e-scooter influence tenders and your ability to deliver?
From our perspective, we operate only pedal bikes and e-bikes, so we do not operate e-scooters, and we operate mainly under the type of contract mentioned by Rebecca, so public contracts. So it influences mainly the writing of tenders. The lead time from the moment it's signed to the delivery got way shorter than before. And I think it's because cities and authorities are more used to seeing people roll out very fast. But obviously the rolling out of e-scooters is very different from public bike share, where you have probably a branding and you have also collaboration with public transport and so on. So it's been influencing on that way, but it's also been influencing in a very positive way where we have more and more mobility hubs, where cities are thinking, okay, we need mobility hubs for the e-scooters and we'll add some bikes and of course have also stations for bikes, otherwise that would be problematic.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. I think that's it from the questions. So I will rather cut the meeting with a final remark, and it's that I've seen that cities and city operators are struggling, and they have some of the same issues. From what I've seen, budget, legal frameworks, and time are some of the common challenges that we should both work in, both on the city side and also on the operator side. So also a message to politicians, if they're seeing us, to have a clear view on how these services work in order to be successful. So I will leave it like that. And I will thank all the speakers for joining us, for the great presentations. I will have a lot of material to share, and also for those who have attended and who are still connected. So thank you so much, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.